A Military Museum Guide. Chapter 1. Military Museum Websites. Military Museum Websites. AMERICANHUEY369.org, American Huey 369. Archives.gov, the National Archives. Army.mil. Army.mil/cmh-pg, Army Center. armyav.org/home-page.html, Army Aviation Heritage Foundation. armyaviationmuseum.org, U.S. Army Aviation Museum. armyheritage.org, U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. armyheritage.org, U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. armyhistory.org, National Museum of the U.S. Army. armyhistory.org/about-the-army-historical-foundation, Army Historical Foundation. awm.lee.army.mil, U.S. Army Women's Museum. azcaf.org, Arizona Wing, Commemorative Air Force. battleshipcove.com, Battleship Cove, History of 10 Types of Naval Ships. bb62museum.org. benning.army.mil/library, U.S. Army Maneuver Center of Excellence Libraries. bunkerflorida.org, Corporal Larry E. Smedley National Vietnam War Museum. cc.giatec.edu/%7et+ch/aero-ps, Air Operations, Vietnam. cc.giatec.edu/%7et+ch/vietnam.html, Vietnam War Resources, Georgia Tech. ddaymuseum.org, National D-Day Museum. 1st Division Museum.org, 1st Infantry Division Museum. hazegray.org/navhist/preserve.htm. history.navy.mil/branches/nhcorg6.htm, Navy Art Collection. history.navy.mil/branches/nhcorg8.htm, Navy Museum. historycentral.com, History's home on the Internet. marineheritage.org, Marine Corps Heritage Foundation. maritime.org/hnsa-guide.htm, Historic Naval Ships Association. militarymuseum.org, California Military Museum. montfordpointmarines.com, Montford Point Marine Association. museumoftheforgottenwarriors.org, Museum of the Forgotten Warriors. nationalmuseum.af.mil, U.S. Air Force Museum. nationalvietnamwarmuseum.org, the National Vietnam War Museum, Texas. naval-air.org, Museum of Naval Aviation. navalaviationmuseum.org, National Museum of Naval Aviation. navysite.de/cvn/cv59.htm, USS Forrestal History. nmajmh.org, Jewish Military History. orlec.org, USS Orlec Naval Museum. Stars and Stripes Museum Library.org, Stars and Stripes Museum. ThePurpleHeart.com, the National Purple Heart Hall of Honor. USMCmuseum.org, National Museum of the Marine Corps. USSAMERICA-MUSEUMFOUNDATION.org, USS America CV-66 Museum Foundation. VeteranMuseum.org, Veterans Museum and Memorial Center. VHPAmuseum.org, Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Museum. Vietnam.ttu.edu, the Vietnam Project, Texas Tech University. VietnamGear.com, Vietnam War, Vietnam Gear. Warplane.org. Warplane.org, National Warplane Museum. Wingsandrotors.org, Wings and Rotors Air Museum. Womensmemorial.org, Women in Military Service for America Memorial. wpafb.af.mil/museum, Air Force. Military Museum websites at dmoz-odp.org/reference/museum/military. Subcategories: Asia, Europe, North America, Oceania. War. Related categories: Reference Museum Science, Reference Museums Transportation Aviation. Society History by Topic Wars and Conflicts. Society Military. HNSA.org, Historic Naval Ships Association Visitor's Guide, promotes the preservation and exhibition of more than 100 naval ships and craft homeported around the world. rudeni.cuna.nom.br/fab/n, History of the Brazilian Air Force, presents history, photos, hours, and directions. Located in Rio de Janeiro. saafmuseum.org.za, the South African Air Force Museum, provides exhibitions of aircraft and art. Details of events, current displays, and aircraft. U.S. Military Monuments. nps.gov, National Park Service. awildorchid.com/monuments2.hdm, Military Monuments. Physical Veteran Memorial websites. 173DAIRBORNEMEMORIAL.org, 173D Airborne Brigade National Memorial. Veterans Memorial.us, Permian Basin Vietnam Veterans Memorial. AVDLM.org, American Veterans Disabled for Life Memorial. PSUVetMemorial.org, Pittsburgh State University Veterans Memorial, Kansas. nps.gov/vive/faqs.hdm, Artifacts left at the wall, FAQs. SDVietnamWarMemorial.com, South Dakota Vietnam War Memorial. vvaa.org.au/memorial.hdm, Australian Vietnam Forces National Memorial. SOMF.org, Special Operations Memorial. barneykin.com/northwall, Canadian Vietnam Memorial, the North Wall. SpecialOps.org, Special Operations Warrior Foundation. CT612memorial.org, Connecticut 612 Memorial. TheHighGround.org, the High Ground Veterans Memorial Park. CVVM.org, Connecticut Vietnam Veterans Memorial. TheMovingWall.org, The Moving Wall. Vietnam Veterans Memorial.org, David Westfall Veterans Foundation Memorial. nps.gov/vive/index.hdm, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. EAHSmemorial.com, Easton Area High School Vietnam Veterans Memorial. hmdb.org/marker.asp marker =49270, U.S. Air Force Pararescue Memorial Parkway. vietmemorialme.com, Michigan Vietnam Memorial. forestalmemorial.com, USS Forrestal Memorial. sysime.tripod.com/msvn.html, Mississippi Vietnam Veterans Memorial. field-of-dreams.org, Western Slope Vietnam War Memorial. New York VietnamVets.org, Vietnam Memorials in New York State. LibertyFundDC.org, National Liberty Memorial. NJVVMF.org, New Jersey Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Veterans Memorial Park Pensacola.com, Vietnam Veterans Wall South, Pensacola FL. VietnamVeterans.Plaza.com/about-Vietnam-Veterans-Plaza, New York Vietnam Veterans Memoria Plaza. VietnamProject.ttu.edu/in-memory/vietwarmem/plaque.hdm, Vietnam War in Memory Memorial Plaque. OVMP.org, Ohio Vietnam Memorial Park. VietnamWomen'sMemorial.org, Vietnam Women's Memorial. War Memorials. ci.berkeley.ca.us/vvm, Berkeley Vietnam Veterans Memorial. THEWALL-USA.com, Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall Page. VVMF.org, Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, official page of Vietnam Vets Memorial. Vietvet.org/thual.hdm, Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall. Vietvet.org/vietmems.hdm, Vietnam Veterans Memorials. BeaconMemorial.org, Beacon, New York, Veterans Electronic Memorial. TheHighGround.org, the High Ground Veterans Memorial. Women'sMemorial.org, the Washington Women's Memorial. WarWidows.org, Widows of War Living Memorial. avtt.org, American Veterans Traveling Tribute. Chapter 2. Military Museums by U.S. State at aam-us.org/about-museum/find-a-museum. Military Museums by U.S. State. World. Armed Forces Middle East/Africa. Reed Museum and 2nd Regiment of Dragoons Heritage Center. Oppo, AE. U.S. Army Europe and 7th Army. Oppo, AE. Alabama. Museum Support Center, Anniston. Anniston, AL. U.S. Army Aviation Museum. Fort Rucker, AL. Armed Forces Pacific. 2nd Infantry Division Museum. Oppo, AP. Arkansas. Museum of Chaffee History. Fort Smith, AR. Arizona. Fort Tuthill Military Museum. Flagstaff, AZ. Fort Huachuca and Military Intelligence Museum. Fort Huachuca, AZ. Yuma Proving Ground Museum. Yuma, AZ. California. 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment Heritage Center. Fort Irwin, CA. Moffett Field Historical Society and Museum. Moffett Field, CA. Flying Leatherneck Aviation Museum. San Diego, CA. Colorado. National Museum of World War II Aviation. Colorado Springs, CO. 4th Infantry Division and Fort Carson Museum. Fort Carson, CO. District of Columbia. American Air Museum in Britain. Washington, D.C. Florida. National Navy SEAL Museum. Fort Pierce, FL. Miami-Dade Military Museum and Memorial. Miami, FL. Military Heritage Museum. Punta Gorda, FL. Military Sea Services Museum. Sebring, FL. Georgia. Maneuver Center of Excellence, MCO, Museum Division. Columbus, GA. National Armor and Cavalry Museum. Columbus, GA. National Infantry Museum. Columbus, GA. U.S. Army Signal Corps Museum. Fort Gordon, GA. 3rd Infantry Division and Fort Stewart Museum. Fort Stewart, GA. Hawaii. USS Bowfin Submarine Museum and Park. Honolulu, HI. U.S. Army Museum of Hawaii. Honolulu, HI. Tropic Lightning Museum. Schofield Barracks, HI. Iowa. Iowa Gold Star Military Museum. Johnston, IA. Illinois. Grand Army of the Republic Memorial and Veterans Military Museum. Aurora, IL. Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Chicago, IL. National Museum of the American Sailor. Great Lakes, IL. Rock Island Arsenal Museum. Rock Island, IL. Kansas. Frontier Army Museum. Fort Leavenworth, KS. 1st Infantry Division and U.S. Cavalry Museum. Fort Riley, KS. Kentucky. Don F. Pratt Museum, 101st Airborne Division Museum. Fort Campbell, KY. General George Patton Museum. Fort Knox, KY. Kentucky Military History Museum. Frankfort, KY. Louisiana. Fort Polk Heritage Center. Fort Polk, LA. Regional Military Museum. Houma, LA. The Arsenal. New Orleans, LA. Louisiana National Guard Museums. New Orleans, LA. Massachusetts. USS Constitution Museum. Boston, MA. Maryland. Maryland Museum of Military History, Maryland Military Historical Society. Baltimore, MD. Fort George G. Meade Museum. Fort George C. Meade, MD. Patuxent River Naval Air Museum. Lexington Park, MD. Maine. Maine Military Historical Society. Augusta, ME. Michigan. The Michigan Heroes Museum. Frankenmuth, MI. Minnesota. Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum. Little Falls, MN. Missouri. U.S. Army Engineer Museum. Fort Leonard Wood, MO. U.S. Army Chemical Corps Museum. Fort Leonard Wood, MO. U.S. Army Military Police Corps Museum. Fort Leonard Wood, MO. North Carolina. Veterans History Museum of the Carolinas. Brevard, NC. Airborne and Special Operations Museum. Fayetteville, NC. 82nd Airborne Division War Museum. Fort Bragg, NC. National Museum of the Army Reserve. Fort Bragg, NC. U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Museum. Fort Bragg, NC. New Hampshire. Portsmouth Submarine Memorial Association. Portsmouth, NH. New Jersey. U.S. Army Reserve Mobilization Museum. Fort Dix, New Jersey. Navy Lakehurst Historical Society. Lakehurst, New Jersey. New Mexico. Nuclear Weapons Instructional Museum, NWIM. Albuquerque, NM. Museum of the American Military Family. T. Harris, NM. White Sands Missile Range Museum. White Sands Missile Range, NM. New York. Harbor Defense Museum. Brooklyn, New York. 10th Mountain Division and Fort Drum Museum. Fort Drum, New York. West Point Museum. West Point, New York. Ohio. Mott's Military Museum. Groveport, O. 103rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Civil War Museum. Sheffield Lake, O. National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. Wright-Patterson AFB, O. Oklahoma. U.S. Army Field Artillery Museum. Fort Sill, OK. U.S. Army Air Defense Artillery Museum. Fort Sill, OK. U.S. Army Fort Sill Fires Center of Excellence, FCO, Museums Division. Fort Sill, OK. Fort Sill National Historic Landmark and Museum. Fort Sill, OK. Muskogee War Memorial. Muskogee, OK. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania National Guard Military Museum. Annville, PA. Pennsylvania Military Museum. Boalsburg, PA. Army Heritage Museum. Carlisle Barracks, PA. U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. Carlisle, PA. Brandywine Battlefield Park. Chadsford, PA. Lomas Center Museum. Gettysburg, PA. Bushy Run Battlefield. Harrison City, PA. Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum. Pittsburgh, PA. South Carolina. U.S. Army Finance Corps Museum. Columbia, SC. South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. Columbia, SC. U.S. Army Basic Combat Training Museum. Fort Jackson, SC. U.S. Army Chaplain Corps Museum. Fort Jackson, SC. U.S. Army Adjutant General's Corps Museum. Fort Jackson, SC. Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum. Mount Pleasant, SC. Marine Corps Recruit Depot. Parris Island, SC. Texas. 1st Armored Division and Fort Bliss Museum. Fort Bliss, TX. U.S. Army Museum of the Non-Commissioned Officer. Fort Bliss, TX. 3rd Cavalry Museum. Fort Hood, TX. Fort Sam Houston Museum. Fort Sam Houston, TX. U.S. Army Medical Department Museum. Fort Sam Houston, TX. Battleship Texas Foundation. Houston, TX. National WASP World War II Museum. Sweetwater, TX. Utah. Hill Aerospace Museum. Hill AFB, UT. Virginia. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Historical Collection. Alexandria, VA. National Guard Bureau Historical Service Division. Arlington, VA. Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington, VA. Army Historical Foundation. Fort Belvoir, VA. National Museum of the United States Army. Fort Belvoir, VA. Museum Support Center, Fort Belvoir. Fort Belvoir, VA. Army Museum Enterprise. Fort Belvoir, VA. U.S. Army Center of Military History, Museums Directorate. Fort Belvoir, VA. U.S. Army Transportation Museum. Fort Eustis, VA. U.S. Army Ordnance Training and Heritage Center. Fort Lee, VA. U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum. Fort Lee, VA. U.S. Army Women's Museum. Fort Lee, VA. Old Guard Museum. Fort Myer, VA. Freedom Museum. Manassas, VA. Hampton Roads Naval Museum. Norfolk, VA. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum. Portsmouth, VA. National Museum of the Marine Corps. Triangle, VA. Washington. Puget Sound Navy Museum. Bremerton, WA. Washington National Guard Museum. Camp Murray, WA. Lewis Army Museum. Joint Base Lewis McChord, WA. U.S. Naval Undersea Museum. Silverdale, WA. Wisconsin. Fort McCoy Historical Holding. Fort McCoy, WI. Wisconsin Veterans Museum. Madison, WI. Military Museum websites. MoffatFieldMuseum.org. FlyingLeathernecks.org. WorldWar2Aviation.org. Carson.army.mil/museum.html. AmericanaIRmuseum.com. NavySealMuseum.org. MiamiMilitaryMuseum.org. MilitaryHeritageMuseum.org. MilsEASVCMuseum.org. Benning.army.mil. Facebook.com/American Museums. Twitter.com/Amers. LinkedIn.com/groups ? Most popular =& git =& 2965314. ArmyAviationMuseum.org. 2id.korea.army.mil/about/museum.asp. chaffeecrossing.com/index.php ? Page == historic-district. FortTuthill.org. HwachucaMuseum.com. yuma.army.mil/history/heritagecenter.aspx. museumsusa.org/museums/info/11527778. nationalinfantrymuseum.org/project/armor-cavalry. nationalinfantrymuseum.org. signal.army.mil/old/history/museum.html. stewart.army.mil/info/?ID =$ 417. garrison.hawaii.army.mil/army-museum. garrison.hawaii.army.mil/tlm. goldstarmuseum.iowa.gov. aurora-il.org/372/grand-army-of-the-republic. pritzkermilitarylibrary.org. history.navy.mil/nmos. riamwr.com/museum.htm. armyupress.army.mil/educational-services/frontier-army-museum. riley.army.mil/about-us/museums. fortcampbell.com/museum/don-f-pratt-museum. generalpatton.org. history.ky.gov/portfolio/kentucky-military-history-museum. jrtc-polk.army.mil/museum.html regionalmilitarymuseum.com, crt.state.la.us/louisiana-state-museum/museum-sites/the-arsenal, goguardmuseums.com, ussconstitutionmuseum.org, marylandmilitaryhistory.org, ftmead.army.mil/museum, paxmuseum.com, mainmillmuseum.org, meheroes.org, mnmilitarymuseum.org, wood.army.mil/museum, wood.army.mil/ccmuseum/ccmuseum/main.hdm, wood.army.mil/usamps/organizations/dpo/museum.html, theveteransmuseum.org, asomf.org, 82ndairbonedivisionsEum.com, usar.army.mil/about-us/history-corners/national-museum-of-the-army-reserve, jfkwebstore.com, ussalbacore.org, dix.army.mil/services/tmd/museum.aspx, nlhs.com, dnws.abq.dtra.mil, Museum of the American Military Family.org, wsmr-history.org, hamilton.army.mil/history.aspx, drum.army.mil/about-fort-drum/pages/fort-drum-museum_lv2.aspx, westpoint.edu/about/history-of-west-point, mottsmilitarymuseum.org, 1030vi.com, nationalmuseum.af.mil, army.mil/fa museum, army.mil/ada museum, army.mil, army.mil/museum/fsnhlm/index.html, warmemorialpark.org, pngmilitarymuseum.org, pamielmuseum.org, carlisle.army.mil/ahc, carlisle.army.mil/ahc/index.cfm, ushistory.org, lamacenter.org, bushrunbattlefield.com, soldiersandsailorshall.org, mybaseguide.com/army/165/605/fort_Jackson_history_and_museums, crr.sc.gov/pages/default.aspx, jackson.armylive.mil/post/museum, columbiacvb.com/listings/us-army-corps-museum/15884/?*1, patriotspoint.org, bliss.army.mil/museum, usasma.army-live.mil/united-states-heritage-center-of-the-noncommissioned-officer, hood.army.mil/3d_acr/3rd_cavalry_museum.aspx, arnierth.army.mil/units/fsh-museum, history.army.mil/museum/field-museum/aimed-museum, battleshiptexas.org, waspmuseum.org, aerospaceutah.org, uzaki.army.mil/about/history, arlingtoncemetery.mil, armyhistory.org, thenmusa.org, history.army.mil, transportation.army.mil/museum/index.html, goordnance.army.mil/authc, qmmuseum.lee.army.mil, awm.lee.army.mil, oldguard.org/regiment/regiment.aspx, freedommuseum.org, history.navy.mil/content/history/museums/hrnm.html, portsmouthnaval-shipyard-museum.com/naval_shipyard/index.html, usmcmuseum.com, history.navy.mil/psnm, mil.wa.gov/museum, lewisarmymuseum.com, navalunderseamuseum.org, mccoy.army.mil/aboutus/commemorative.asp, wisvetsmuseum.com. Chapter 3. 500 plus U.S. military museum websites at Museum SUSA. 103rd Engineers. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 1st Cavalry Division Museum. first-team.us/tableaus/apndx_13. Fort Hood, Texas. 1st Troop Philadelphia City Cavalry. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 3rd Cavalry Museum. hood.army.mil/3d_cr. Fort Hood, Texas. 45th Infantry Division Museum. 45thdivisionsmuseum.com. Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. 82nd Airborne Division War Memorial Museum. 82ndairbornedivisionmuseum.com. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. ACW Artillery Association. acwartillery.com. Rochester, New York. AMA Museum/Augusta Military Academy. AMAalumni.org/museum. Fort Defiance, Virginia. Admiral Nimitz Museum/National Museum of the Pacific War. NIMITZ-museum.org. Fredericksburg, Texas. Aerospace Discovery at the Florida Air Museum at Sun and Fun. FloridaAirMuseum.org. Lakeland, Florida. Aerospace Museum of California. Aerospace Museum of California.org. McClellan, California. African American Civil War Museum. AfromCivilWar.org. Washington, District of Columbia. Air Force Armament Museum. afarmamentmuseum.com. Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. Air Force Flight Test Center Museum. aftcmuseum.org. Edwards Air Force Base, California. Air Force Space and Missile Museum. afspacemuseum.org. Patrick AFB, Florida. Air Mobility Command Museum. amcmuseum.org. Dover AFB, Delaware. Air Zoo Aviation History Museum of Kalamazoo. airzoo.com. Portage, Michigan. Air and Power Museum of Hampton. Hampton, Virginia. Airborne and Special Operations Museum. asomf.org. Fayetteville, North Carolina. Airman Memorial Museum. afsahq.org. Suitland, Maryland. Alabama Veterans Museum and Archives. alabamaveteransmuseum.com. Athens, Alabama. Alamance Battleground State Historic Site. nchhistoricsite.org/alamance/alamanc.hdm. Burlington, North Carolina. Aldie Mill, Virginia Outdoor Foundation. virginiaoutdoorsfoundation.org. Aldie, Virginia. Aliceville Museum. alicevillemuseum.org. Aliceville, Alabama. All Wars Museum. quincynet.com/ivh/museum.hdm. Quincy, Illinois. Allegheny Arms and Armor Museum. armormuseum.com. Allegheny Kiski Valley Historical Society. akvhs.org. Tarentum, Pennsylvania. Allied Air Force Museum. Allentown, Pennsylvania. Alton Museum of History and Art. altonmuseum.com. America's Military and First Responders Museum. Naples Museum Militaryhistory.org. Naples, Florida. American Armored Foundation, Tank Museum. aaftankmuseum.com. Danville, Virginia. American Celebration on Parade and Shenandoah Caverns. shenandoahcaverns.com. Shenandoah Caverns, Virginia. American Merchant Marine Museum. usma.edu/museum. Kings Point, New York. American Military Museum. AmericanMilitaryMuseum.org. Charleston, South Carolina. American Military Museum of Gastonia. Gastonia, North Carolina. American Society of Military History, ASMH. Tangclan.com. South El Monte, California. American War Museum. Canal Winchester, Ohio. Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company Museum. ahasi.us.com. Boston, Massachusetts. Anna Jarvis Birthplace Museum. AnnaJarvisMuseum.com. Grafton, West Virginia. Antiquarian and Landmarks Society. Heartnet.org/ALS. Hartford, Connecticut. Antrim Historical Society. Antrim, New Hampshire. Apalachicola Maritime Museum. amfl.org. Apalachicola, Florida. Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. nps.gov/apco. Appomattox, Virginia. Arizona Wing Commemorative Air Force. ArizonaWingCAF.com. Mesa, Arizona. Arkansas National Guard Museum. RNGmuseum.com. North Little Rock, Arkansas. Armed Forces History Museum. ArmedForcesMuseum.com. Largo, Florida. Armed Forces Med. Muse. Armed Forces Inns. Washington, District of Columbia. Army Aviation Museum. ArmyAvianMuseum.org. Army Aviation Museum Foundation. ArmyAvianMuseum.org. Fort Rucker, Alabama. Atmore Oliver House Museum. newbernhistorical.org/atmore-oliver-history. New Bern, North Carolina. Autauga County Heritage Association. autaugaHeritage.org. Prattville, Alabama. Aviation Wing of the Marietta Museum of History. MariettaHistory.org. Avoca Museum and Historical Society. avocamuseum.org. Alta Vista, Virginia. Brevard Veterans Memorial Center Museum. veteransmemorialcenter.org. Merritt Island, Florida. Ballard Locks, Hiram Chittenden Locks. ballardlocks.org. Seattle, Washington. Baltimore Civil War Museum. angelfire.com/biz/President's D Station. Baltimore, Maryland. Barbara Fritchie House. frederickTourism.org. Frederick, Maryland. Barrett Township Historical Society, Cresco Station Museum. barretthistory.org/museum.php. Cresco, Pennsylvania. Barron County Historical Society Pioneer Village Museum. barroncountymuseum.com. Cameron, Wisconsin. Barrow County Museum. cityofwinder.com/index.aspx $page=46. Winder, Georgia. Barrow Foundation Museum. Eola, Texas. Battle of Plattsburgh Association. battleofplattsburgh.org. Plattsburgh, New York. Battleship Cove. battleshipcove.org. Fall River, Massachusetts. Battleship North Carolina. Wilmington, North Carolina. Battleship South Dakota. Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Battleship Texas State Historical Site. tpwd.state.tx.us/park/battlesH. Lawport, Texas. Baxter County Heritage Museum. baxtercountyonline.com/bchgs. Gassville, Arkansas. Baxter Springs Heritage Center and Museum. baxterspringsmuseum.org. Baxter Springs, Kansas. Bay of Pigs Museum and Library of the Brigade 2506 Inc. BAYOFPIGSBRIGADE2506.com Miami, Florida. Belrickton Museum. Belding, Michigan. Bennett Place Historic Site. BennettPlaceHistoricSite.com. Durham, North Carolina. Bennett Place State Historic Site. BennettPlaceHistoricSite.com. Durham, North Carolina. Benton County Historical Society and Museum. mnbentonhistory.org. Sauk Rapids, Minnesota. Bentonville Battleground State Historic Site. bentonvillebattlefield.nchistorocscites.org. Four Oaks, North Carolina. Bighorn County Museum Historical Society. bighorncountymuseum.org. Hardin, Montana. Black River Academy. bramvt.org. Ludlow, Vermont. Black Hawk Genealogical Society Rock Island and Mercer Counties. rootsweb.com/il Rockkiss. Rock Island, Illinois. Blue and Gray Museum. fitzgeraldga.org. Ballinger County Museum of Natural History. bcmnh.org. Marble Hill, Missouri. Border Historical Society. borderhistoricalsociety.com. Eastport, Maine. Bosman Trail Museum. Bighorn, Wyoming. Brazoria Historical Museum. brazoriahf.org. Brazoria, Texas. Bremerton Historic Ships Association. ussternerjoy.org/membership.html. Bremerton, Washington. Bristol Train of Artillery. Explore bristolri.com/things-to-do/attractions-and-tours/bristol-train-of-artillery. Bristol, Rhode Island. Broken Arrow Historical Society. brokenarrowwalk.gov/index.aspx page =253. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Brunswick Town State Historic Site. nchhistoricscites.org/brunswic/brunswic.htm. Winnebago, North Carolina. Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave. buffalobill.org. Golden, Colorado. Buffalo Soldiers National Museum. buffalosoldiermuseum.com. Houston, Texas. Bullion Plaza Cultural Center and Museum. auctioncatalogcompany.com/museum. Miami, Arizona. Bureau County Hist. Society Museum. Princeton, Illinois. Burnett County Historical Society. theforts.org. Danbury, Wisconsin. Bushwhacker Museum and Jail. bushwhacker.org. Nevada, Missouri. Bushy Run Battlefield Heritage Society. bushyrunbattlefield.com. Jeanette, Pennsylvania. Butte Community Historical Center and Museum. buttenebraska.com. Butte, Nebraska. CAF. Southern California Wing, World War II Aviation Museum. orgsites.com/ca/caf-socal. Camarillo, California. CAF Air Power Museum. airpowermuseum.org. Midland, Texas. Carolina Military Vehicle Preservation Association. cmvpa.com. Kenly, North Carolina. California State Military Museum, closed. kcra.com/news/missing-artifacts-prompt-military-to-close-museum/28264568. Sacramento, California. Camden County Museum. camdencountymuseum.com. Lynn Creek, Missouri. Cameron Art Museum. cameronartmuseum.com. Wilmington, North Carolina. Camp Atterbury Veterans Memorial. campatterbury.org. Edinburgh, Indiana. Camp Blanding Museum. Camp Gordon Johnston World War II Museum. campgordonjohnston.com. Carabel, Florida. Camp Grant Museum. Rockford, Illinois. Camp Hancock State Historic Site, State Historical Society of North Dakota. history.nd.gov/historic sites/hancock/index.html. Bismarck, North Dakota. Camp McDowell. campmcdowell.com. Nauvoo, Alabama. Camp San Luis Obispo Museum. militarymuseum.org. San Luis Obispo, California. Camp Van Dorn World War II Museum, Inc. vandorn.org. Camp Washington Carver. wvculture.org/sites/carver.html. Clifftop, West Virginia. Camp White Military Museum. 300THCOMBATENGINERSINWWII.com/camp.html. White City, Oregon. Kenfield War Veterans Museum. Kenfield, Ohio. Cannonball House Museum. cannonballhouse.org. Macon, Georgia. Cantigny Gardens and Museums. cantigny.org. Wheaton, Illinois. Caribou Historical Center and Museum. Visit aroostook.com/article/caribou_historical_center_museum. Caribou, Maine. Cedar Key Historical Society Museum. Central Maryland Heritage League, Inc. cmhl.org. Middletown, Maryland. Central Rappahannock Heritage Center. crhcarchives.org. Fredericksburg, Virginia. Charlestown Landing State Historic Site. charlestownlanding.travel. Cherokee County History and Arts Museum. cherokeecountyhistory.org. Gaffney, South Carolina. Chico Air Museum. chicoairmuseum.org. Chico, California. Chillicothe Historical Society Museum. Chillicothe, Illinois. Christian C. Sanderson Museum. sandersonmuseum.org. Chadsford, Pennsylvania. Christian County Historical Society and Museum. christiancountyhistorical.com. Taylorville, Illinois. Cincinnati Aviation Heritage Society. cahslunkin.org. Cincinnati, Ohio. Civil War Museum. kenosha.org/Civil War. Kenosha, Wisconsin. Civil War Museum of Jackson CO. historiclonejack.org. Lone Jack, Missouri. Civil War Museum Outpost 11. Spring, Texas. Civil War and Underground Railroad Museum of Philadelphia. cwurmuseum.org. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Clara Foster Slough Museum of Enlow. enlowmuseum.blogspot.com. Enlow, Texas. Cloud County Historical Society Museum. cloudcountymuseum.org. Concordia, Kansas. Cold War Air Museum. coldwarairmuseum.org. Lancaster, Texas. Collingwood Library and Museum on Americanism. nationalsojourners.org. Springfield, Virginia. Colonel Charles Waterhouse Historical Museum. waterhousemuseum.com. Toms River, New Jersey. Columbus Chapel and Bowell Mansion Museum. bowellmuseum.com. Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. Concordia Area Heritage Society. Confederate Memorial Park. preservala.org/confederatepark.aspx. Marbury, Alabama. Constitution Island. usma.edu/garrison/sites/mwr/conisland.asp. West Point, New York. CPL. Larry E. Smedley National Vietnam War Museum. bunkerflorida.org. CPL. Smedley National Vietnam War Museum. nwmvocf.org. Orlando, Florida. Cradle of Aviation Museum. cradleofaviation.org. Garden City, New York. Cumberland County Historical and Genealogical Society. Cumberland County Historical Society.org. Greenup, Illinois. Cudahy Military Museum. TacoaHistory.com. Toccoa, Georgia. Custer Battlefield Museum. CusterMuseum.org. Garryowen, Montana. Cynthiana Harrison County Museum. CynthianaKY.com/Cynthiana Museum. Cynthiana, Kentucky. Dahlgren Heritage Museum. DahlgrenMuseum.org. Dahlgren, Virginia. DeLand Naval Air Station Museum. DeLandNavalAirStation.org. DeLand, Florida. Decatur County Historical Museum. DecaturCountyHistory.org. Depot Museum. kci.net/history. Julesburg, Colorado. Day Mansion.
nj-passacicounty.civic+.com/facilities/details/day-mansion-25.
Wayne, New Jersey. Diego Sepulveda Adobe Estancia of Costa Mesa. CostaMesaHistory.org. Costa Mesa, California. Dr. Lamar's Sanitarium. Middletown.md.us. Middletown, Maryland. Dundalk Patapsco Historical Society and Museum. Dundalk Train Garden at blogpost.com. Dundalk, Maryland. Dunn County Museum. Dunn Center, North Dakota. EAA AirVenture Museum. airventuremuseum.org. Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Echoes Through Time Leering Center and Civil War Museum. echoesthroughtime.com. Springville, New York. Edgar County Genealogy Library. Paris, Illinois. Edgecombe County Veterans Military Museum. edgecombevet.com. Tarboro, North Carolina. 8th Maine Regiment Association. athmaneregimentpeaksisland.com. Peaks Island, Maine. Eldred World War II Museum. eldredworldwar2museum.org. Eldred, Pennsylvania. Emil A. Blackmore Museum of the American Legion. Legion.org. Indianapolis, Indiana. Empire State Aerosciences Museum. esam.org. Glenville, New York. Engadine Historical Society. sites.google.com/view/Engadine Historical Museum. Engadine, Michigan. Epiphany Chapel and Church House, only WWI Chapel in the United States. epiphany-md.org. Odenton, Maryland. Ernie Pyle State Historic Site. Dana, Indiana. Estrella Warbird Museum. ewarbids.org. Paso Robles, California. U Harley History Museum. notatlanta.org. U Harley, Georgia. Eureka Pioneer Museum of McPherson County. Eureka, South Dakota. 5th Maine Regiment Museum. 5thMaineMuseum.org. Peaks Island, Maine. 1st Division Museum. 1stDivisionMuseum.org. Wheaton, Illinois. Flying Heritage Collection. FlyingHeritage.com. Everett, Washington. Fork Union Military Academy Museum. ForkUnion.com. Fork Union, Virginia. Fort Belknap. tshaonline.org/handbook/entries/Fort-Belknap. Newcastle, Texas. Fort Boykin. HistoricISLEOFWhite.com. Isle of Wight County, Virginia. Fort Dalles Museum. FortDallesMuseum.org. The Dalles, Oregon. Fort Defiance. FortDefianceNC.org. Lanier, North Carolina. Fort Devens Museum. FortDevensMuseum.org. Devens, Massachusetts. Fort Gaines Historic Site. DauPhinisland.org. Dauphin Island, Alabama. Fort George G. Meade Museum. ftmeade.army.mil/museum/index.html. Odenton, Maryland. Fort George G. Meade Museum. ftmeade.army.mil/museum/index.htm. Fort George G. Meade, Maryland. Fort Huachuca Army Intelligence Museum. huachucamuseum.com. Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Fort Huachuca Museum. huachuca.army.mil/sites/history/html/3fhmuse.html. Fort Huger. historicisleofwhite.com. Isle of Wight County, Virginia. Fort Massac State Park and Hist. Site. Metropolis, Illinois. Fort Meigs State Memorial, Ohio Historical Society. fortmeigs.org. Perrysburg, Ohio. Fort Mifflin on the Delaware. fortmifflin.us. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Fort Mose Historic State Park. floridatateparks.org/park/fort-mose. St. Augustine, Florida. Fort Recovery State Memorial, Ohio Historical Society. ohsweb.ohiohistory.org/places/nw07/index.shtml. Fort Recovery, Ohio. Fort Sam Houston Museum. sanantoniocvb.com/fort_sam_houston.asp. Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Fort Sedgwick Museum and Archives. Julesburg, Colorado. Fort Sill National Historic Landmark and Museum. Sill. Army.mil/museum. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Fort Sisseton Visitor Center. sdgfp.info/parks/regions/glacial lakes/fortsisseton.htm. Lake City, South Dakota. Fort Ward Museum and Historic Site. fortward.org. Alexandria, Virginia. Fort Washita Military Park. Durant, Oklahoma. Fort Worth Aviation Museum. fortworthaviationmuseum.com. Fort Worth, Texas. Fountain County War Museum. Veedasburg, Indiana. Franklin Historical Museum. franklinhistoricalmuseum.org. Franklin, Massachusetts. Fraser International History Museum. FraserArmsMuseum.org. Louisville, Kentucky. Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Site. nps.gov/frsb/index.htm. Fredericksburg, Virginia. Fresno Historical Society. valleyhistory.org. Fresno, California. Friends of Jefferson Barracks. St. Louis, Missouri. Frisco Depot and Museum. friscodepot.org. Hugo, Oklahoma. Frontiers of Flight Museum. flightmuseum.com. Fulton County, Museum and Fulton County Historical Society. fultoncountys.org. Wauseon, Ohio. GAR. MEM. And Veterans Military Muse. Galva Hist. SOC/Wiley House. Galva, Illinois. Garretson Area Historical Society Heritage Museum. garretsonmuseum.wordpress.com. Garretson, South Dakota. General Tommy Franks Leadership Institute and Museum. TommyFranksMuseum.org. Hobart, Oklahoma. George C. Marshall Museum. MarshallFoundation.org. Lexington, Virginia. George Washington's Grist Mill Historical State Park. Mount Vernon, Virginia. Glendower Mansion. wchsmuseum.org/index.php/Glendower-Mansion. Lebanon, Ohio. Glen L. Martin Maryland Aviation Museum. mdaremuseum.org. Goldsboro Historical Society. goldsborohistory.org. Goldsboro, Maine. Graz Historical Society. Grazspa.org. Graz, Pennsylvania. Grays Harbor Historical Seaport. LadyWashington.org. Aberdeen, Washington. Great Lakes Museum of Military History. militaryhistorymuseum.org/about.html. Michigan City, Indiana. Great Lakes Naval Museum. history.navy.mil/museum/Great Lakes/index.htm. Great Lakes, Illinois. Greater St. Louis Air and Space Museum. aerospacemuseum.org/index. Cahokia, Illinois. Greater Shenandoah Historical Society Museum. greatershenandoahs.org. Shenandoah, Iowa. Greene County Museum Incorporated of Paragould. Paragould, Arkansas. Graybull Museum. Grissom Air Museum State Historic Site. GrissomAirMuseum.com. Peru, Indiana. Gulf Islands National Seashore. nps.gov/GUIs. Gulf Breeze, Florida. H. Earl Clack Museum. co.hill.mt.us/museum/heritage_center.html. Havre, Montana. HEARTS. Helping Every American Remember Through Serving, Veterans Museum. heartsmuseum.com. Huntsville, Texas. HGI Exchange Hotel Civil War Museum. hgiexchange.org. Gordonsville, Virginia. Hampton Roads Naval Museum. hrnm.navy.mil. Norfolk, Virginia. Harrison County Historical Museum. harrisoncountymuseum.org. Marshall, Texas. Harrisonburg Rockingham Historical Society. heritagecenter.com. Dayton, Virginia. Henry Whitfield State Museum. cultureandtourism.org. Guilford, Connecticut. Heritage Museum of Montgomery, Texas. heritagemuseum.us. Conroe, Texas. Hess Heritage Museum. Ashton, Idaho. Hill Aerospace Museum. aerospaceutah.org. Hill AFB, Utah. Hill Air Force Base. hill.af.mil. Roy, Utah. Historic Camden Revolutionary War Site. historic-camden.net. Camden, South Carolina. Historic Falsington, Incorporated. historicfalsington.org. Falsington, Pennsylvania. Historic Fort Steilacoom Association. historicfortsteilacoom.org. Lakewood, Washington. Historical Military Armor Museum, Division of McLean Museum. Anderson, Indiana. Historical Steam and Living History, Inc. GreatRiverRoad.com. Jerseyville, Illinois. History Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale Historical Society.org. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Holland Land Office Museum. hollandlandoffice.com. Batavia, New York. Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center. hmcec.org. Naples, Florida. House of Refuge Museum at Gilbert's Bar. houseofrefugeefl.org. Stuart, Florida. Houston Maritime Museum. houstonmaritimemuseum.org. Houston, Texas. Hutchings Museum Institute. johnhutchingsmuseum.org. Lehigh, Utah. Idaho Military History Museum. museum.mil.idaho.gov. Boise, Idaho. Illinois State Military Museum. springfield.il.com/attract/military.html. Springfield, Illinois. Indian Wars Museum. Bargersville, Indiana. Indiana Military Museum. indianamilitarymuseum.com. Vincennes, Indiana. Indiana War Memorial Museum. state.in.us/IWM. Indianapolis, Indiana. InfoCenter Alabama, Inc. InfoCenterAlabama.com. Helena, Alabama. Invest in America Veterans Foundation/SW Florida Military Museum and Library. swfmm.org. Cape Coral, Florida. IRAG Ross/Niagara Aerospace Museum. WNYAerospace.org. Niagara Falls, New York. J.M. Davis Arms and Historical Museum. TheGunMuseum.com. Claremore, Oklahoma. JFK Special Warfare Museum. Jacksonville Automobile and Motorcycle Museum. jacksautomuseum.org. Jacksonville, Florida. Jersey County Historical Society. JerseyUSA.net. Jerseyville, Illinois. Johannes Schwalm Historical Association, Inc. Scotland, Pennsylvania. John Paul Jones House. PortsmouthHistory.org. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Keithsburg Museum. Keithsburg.com/museum/C8FD. Keithsburg, Illinois. Kenosha Public Museum. museums.kenosha.org/public. Kenosha, Wisconsin. Kent County Tourism. Visit Dover.com. Dover, Delaware. Kentucky Historical Society. history.ky.gov. Frankfort, Kentucky. Kentucky Museum. wku.edu/Kentucky Museum. Bowling Green, Kentucky. Kewanee Historical Society. KewaneeHistory.com. Keystone Crossroads Historical Society and Museum. Manford, Oklahoma. Kittery Hist and Naval Museum. KitteryMuseum.com. LA Military Museum. sos.louisiana.gov/museums. Ruston, Louisiana. LaPorte County Historical Society, Inc. LaPorteCountyHistory.org. LaPorte, Indiana. Lake City/Columbia County Historical Museum. lccchm.org. Lake City, Florida. Larimore Community Museum. Larimore, North Dakota. Legacy Flight Museum. rexburg.org/pages/lfm-legacy-flight-museum. Rexburg, Idaho. Lightship Portsmouth Museum. portsnavalmuseums.com/about_lightship.html. Portsmouth, Virginia. Lincoln Train Museum. gettysburg.battlefield-tours.com/lincoln-train-museum.php. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Living Civil War History Museum. Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Livingston County War Museum and Dal Estes Education Center. warmuseum.blogspot.com. Pontiac, Illinois. Lone Star Flight Museum/Texas Aviation Hall of Fame. LoneStarFlight.org. Galveston, Texas. Love County Military Museum. Marietta, Oklahoma. Loxahatchee River Historical Society. JupiterLighthouse.org. Jupiter, Florida. Lynchburg Museum. lynchburgmuseum.org. Lynchburg, Virginia. Maps Air Museum. mapsairmuseum.org. North Canton, Ohio. Mel Fisher Maritime Heritage Society and Museum. mlfisher.org. Key West, Florida. Military Heritage Collection North Texas. militaryheritagecollection.org. Nevada, Texas. Maine Military Museum and Learning Center. mainemilitarymuseum.info. South Portland, Maine. Manassas National Battlefield Park. nps.gov/mana/index.hdm. Manassas, Virginia. Marchfield Air Museum. marchfield.org. Riverside, California. May Museum and Park. farmville-nc.com/departments_main-museum.htm. Farmville, North Carolina. Miami Valley Military History Museum. mvmhum.com. Dayton, Ohio. Middlesex County Historical Society. middlesexhistory.org. Middletown, Connecticut. Mighty 8th Air Force Museum. mighty8th.org. Pooler, Georgia. Military Aviation Museum. militaryaviationmuseum.org. Virginia Beach, Virginia. Military Heritage Museum. freedomisn'tfree.org. Punta Gorda, Florida. Military and Space Museum. geocities.com/cprofoda/museum.html. Houston, Texas. Mills County Historical Museum. millscountymuseum.questoffice.net. Glenwood, Iowa. Minnesota Historical Society. mnhs.org. St. Paul, Minnesota. Modoc County Historical Museum. Alturas, California. Montgomery County Historical Society. oldfortjohnson.org. Fort Johnson, New York. Morristown National Historical Park. nps.gov/more. Morristown, New Jersey. Mount Gilead Historic Site. mountgilead.org. Beacon, New York. Mud Lake Historical Society and Museum. mudlakemuseum.com. Territon, Idaho. Municipal and Military Museum. Nitro, West Virginia. Museum of Military History. museumofmilitaryhistory.com. Kissimmee, Florida. Museum and Library of Confederate History. confederatemuseum.org. Greenville, South Carolina. Museum of Fife and Drum. companyoffifeanddrum.org/museum. Ivoryton, Connecticut. Museum of Flight. museumofflight.org. Seattle, Washington. Museum of History and Holocaust Education. kennesaw.edu/historymuseum. Kennesaw, Georgia. Museum of Missouri Military History. Jefferson City, Missouri. Museum of Mountain Flying. museummountainflying.org. Missoula, Montana. Museum of the Soldier. museumofthesoldier.com. Portland, Indiana. Museum of 20th Century Warfare. m20cwinfo.org. Indianapolis, Indiana. NM Wing, Confederate Air Force Museum. Hobbs, New Mexico. Naples Depot Museum. colliermuseums.com. Naples, Florida. National Air and Space Museum. nasm.si.edu. Washington, District of Columbia. National Aviation Hall of Fame. nationalaviation.org. Dayton, Ohio. National Cryptologic Museum Foundation. cryptologicfoundation.org. Fort George G. Meade, Maryland. National Electronics Museum. nationalelectronicsmuseum.org. Linthicum, Maryland. National Guard Military Museum. New Jersey MilitiaMuseum.org. Lawrenceville, New Jersey. National Guard Militia Museum of New Jersey. New Jersey MilitiaMuseum.org. National Hansen's Disease Museum. hrsa.gov/Hansen's/museum. Carville, Louisiana. National Infantry Museum. nationalinfantrymuseum.com. Fort Benning, Georgia. National Infantry Museum and Soldier Center. nationalinfantrymuseum.org. Columbus, Georgia. National Liberty Ship Memorial/S.S. Jeremiah O'Brien. ssjeremiahobrien.org. San Francisco, California. National Military History Center. dvkfoundation.org. Auburn, Indiana. National Military History Center. militaryhistorycenter.org. Auburn, Indiana. National Museum of African American History and Culture. Washington.org/Smithsonian-Institution-Museums. Washington, District of Columbia. National Museum of American History. americanhistory.si.edu/index.cfm. Washington, District of Columbia. National Museum of Civil War Medicine. civilwarmed.org. Frederick, Maryland. National Museum of Health and Medicine. medicalmuseum.mil. Silver Spring, Maryland. National Museum of the Marine Corps. usmcmuseum.com. Triangle, Virginia. National Museum of the United States Air Force. nationalmuseum.af.mil. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. National Museum of the United States Navy. history.navy.mil/branches/org8-1.hdm. Washington, District of Columbia. National Naval Aviation Museum. naval-air.org. Pensacola, Florida. National Training Center and 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment Museum. irwin.army.mil/communities/11acrmuseum.aspx. National Veterans Memorial and Museum. nationalvmm.org. Columbus, Ohio. National World War I Museum at Liberty Memorial. theworldwar.org. Kansas City, Missouri. Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Museum. nasflmuseum.com. Ft. Lauderdale, Florida. Naval Undersea Museum. history.navy.mil/museum/keyport/index1.hdm. Keyport, Washington. New London Maritime Society and Custom House Maritime Museum. nlmaritimesociety.org. New London, Connecticut. New Mexico National Guard Bataan Memorial Museum. batanmuseum.com. Santa Fe, New Mexico. New Windsor Cantonment State Historic Site. friendsofpalisades.org. Vales Gate, New York. New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center. Saratoga Springs, New York. North Delta Museum. Friars Point, Mississippi. North Lee County Historical Society. FortMadisonHistory.org. Fort Madison, Iowa. Northern California Veterans Museum and Heritage Center. NorCalVeteransMuseum.org. Redding, California. Octave Chanute Aerospace Museum. Aeromuseum.org. Rantoul, Illinois. Oklahoma History Center. okhistorycenter.org. Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Old Bradford Pioneer Village. ChickasawTrails.com. Nashua, Iowa. Old Fort Bliss Museum. Fort Bliss, Texas. Old Fort Jackson. chsgeorgia.org/home.cfm/page/oldfortjackson.hdm. Savannah, Georgia. Old Fort Johnson. oldfortjohnson.org. Fort Johnson, New York. Old Fort Meade Museum. fortmeademuseum.org. Fort Meade, South Dakota. Old Fort Parker. oldfortparker.org. Old Guard Museum. Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine. cultureandtourism.org. East Granby, Connecticut. Old Town House Museum. goldsborohistory.org/home/museum. Goldsboro, Maine. Orange County Historical Museum. orangeNChistory.org. Hillsborough, North Carolina. Ormond Memorial Art Museum and Gardens. ormondartmuseum.org. Ormond Beach, Florida. Overland Trail Museum. sterlingcolorado.com/?page_ID=145. Sterling, Colorado. PMC Museum at Widener University. widener.edu/PMC Museum. Chester, Pennsylvania. Pacific Battleship Center, Battleship USS Iowa. PacificBattleship.com. San Pedro, California. Pamplin Historical Park and the National Museum of the Civil War Soldier. PamplinPark.org. Petersburg, Virginia. Pappy Boyington Field Museum, Inc. PappyBoyingtonFieldMuseumInc.org. Hayden, Idaho. Pathways to History, Military History/Veterans Tribute. sanfordfl.gov/index.aspx page =482. Sanford, Florida. Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum. patriotspoint.org. Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Penfield Homestead Museum. penfieldmuseum.org. Crown Point, New York. Pennsylvania Military College at Widener University. widener.edu/PMC Museum. Chester, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania Military Museum. POMIELmuseum.org. Boalsburg, Pennsylvania. Petite Neat Museum and Cultural Arts Center. petiteneatmuseum.org. Payson, Utah. Petersburg Museums. Petersburg, Virginia. Peterson Air and Space Museum. petemuseum.org. Peterson AFB, Colorado. Pike County Historical Society/Museum. pikecoilhistory.org. Pine County History Museum and Historical Society. pinecountyhistorymuseum.org. Askov, Minnesota. Pittsfield Historical Society. pittsfield-nh.com. Pittsfield, Vermont. Plains of Fame Air Museum. plainsoffame.org. Chino, California. Plains of Fame Air Museum, Arizona. plainsoffame.org. Valle Williams, Arizona. Polish Military Hist. SOC of America. Chicago, Illinois. Porter County Museum. portercountymuseum.org. Valparaiso, Indiana. Portsmouth Museums Foundation. portsmouthmuseumsfoundation.org. Portsmouth, Virginia. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard Museum. portsmouthnavalshipyardmuseum.com. Portsmouth, Virginia. Prataugan Museum, Autauga County Heritage Center. autauga-history.org/prataugan-museum.html. Prattville, Alabama. Puget Sound Coast Artillery Museum. Port Townsend, Washington. Puget Sound Navy Museum. pugetsoundnavymuseum.org. facebook.com/pugetsoundnavymuseum. Bremerton, Washington. Pulaski Area Historical Society. PulaskiWIHistory.com. Pulaski, Wisconsin. Pulaski County Historical Society. PulaskiHistory.com. Rawls Historical Museum. rootsweb.ancestry.com/txcrosby/museum.hdm. Rawls, Texas. Range Riders, Inc. rangerridersmuseum.org. Miles City, Montana. Republic County Historical Society Museum. nexen.com/homepage/redpcomuse/home.htm. Belleville, Kansas. Richmond National Battlefield Park. Richmond, Virginia. Rocky Ford Museum. City of Rockyford.colorado.gov/r-community/museum. Rocky Ford, Colorado. Ropke Armor Museum. ROPikeArmorMuseum.com. Crawfordsville, Indiana. Rossville Historical Society. rossvilleshops.com/society.html. Rossville, Illinois. Russell County Historical Society. russellcountyhistory.org. Lebanon, Virginia. SS. Lane Victory Memorial Museum. lanavictory.org. San Pedro, California. San Diego Air and Space Museum. San Diego AIRANSpace.org. San Diego, California. Schenectady County Historical Society. Schist.org. Schenectady, New York. Schuyler Jail Museum. Rushville, Illinois. CO Historical Museum. CO, Ohio. Scituate Historical Society. ScituateHistoricalSociety.org. Scituate, Massachusetts. CB Museum and Memorial Park. cbsmuseum.com. Seacoast Science Center. seacoastscienceCenter.org. Rye, New Hampshire. Seattle Sutton Marseilles Museum. ssme.org. Marseilles, Illinois. Shelby Museum of History. ShelbyOhioMuseum.com. Silent Wings Museum. SilentWingsMuseum.com. Lubbock, Texas. Sitka Historical Society Museum. SitkaHistory.org. Sitka, Alaska. Smith County Heritage Museum. rootsweb.com/TN-Smith/heritage. Carthage, Tennessee. Soldiers National Museum. GettysburgBattlefield-Tours.com/soldiers-national-museum.php. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Solomon Rockwell House. Winsted, Connecticut. South Dakota National Guard Museum. mva.sd.gov/natal_guard_museum.html. Pierre, South Dakota. South Dakota State Historical Society. History.sd.gov. Pierre, South Dakota. South Lake County Historical Society and Claremont Historic Village Museum. CleremontVillage.org/visitor. Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History. southernmuseum.org. Kennesaw, Georgia. Southwest Florida Military Museum and Library. veterans-foundation.org. Cape Coral, Florida. St. Louis Aviation Museum. St. Louis, Missouri. St. Augustine Historical Society. staugustinehistoricalsociety.org. St. Augustine, Florida. St. Lucie County Regional History Center. stlucieco.gov/history. Stanton Military Academy Museum. sma-alumni.org. Stanton, Virginia. Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. arandspace.si.edu/museum/Udvar-Hazy. Chantilly, Virginia. Stevens Memorial Museum. johnhaycenter.org. Salem, Indiana. Stockton Field Aviation Museum. stocktonfieldmuseum.org. Stockton, California. Stockton Historical Maritime Museum. stocktonhistoricalmaritimemuseum.org. Stockton, California. Sully Historic Site. fairfaxcounty.gov/parks/Sully. Chantilly, Virginia. Sumter County Museum. sumtercountymuseum.org. Sumter, South Carolina. Swannanoa Valley Museum. swannanoavalleymuseum.org. Black Mountain, North Carolina. Swedish American Museum. Sweetsburg, Iowa. Swisher County Archives and Museum Association. swishercountymuseum.org. Tulia, Texas. Taft Blackland Museum. blacklandmuseum.com. Taft, Texas. Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. tvrail.com. Chattanooga, Tennessee. Texas Air Museum. texasairmuseum.org. San Antonio, Texas. Texas Historical Commission. thc.state.tx.us. Austin, Texas. Textile Heritage Museum. textileheritagemuseum.org. Burlington, North Carolina. The Air Force Enlisted Heritage Hall. afri.maxwell.af.mil. Montgomery, Alabama. The American Historical Foundation. ahfrichmond.com. Richmond, Virginia. The Beaufort Arsenal Museum. Beaufort, South Carolina. The Camp Roberts Historical Museum. CampRobertsHistoricalMuseum.com. Camp Roberts, California. The Casemate Museum. Fort Monroe, Virginia. The 8th Maine Regiment Memorial Association, Inc. athmaine.org. Peaks Island, Maine. The Heritage Center of Murfreesboro and Rutherford County. hcmrc.org. Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The Heritage Museum. valleyheritagemuseum.org. Dayton, Virginia. The Lost Squadron exhibit at Bell County Airport. bellcounty.ky.gov/services/pages/airport.aspx. Middlesboro, Kentucky. The MacArthur Memorial. macarthurmemorial.org. Norfolk, Virginia. The Mansion and Museums at Morven Park. morvenpark.org. Leesburg, Virginia. The Mariners Museum and Park. marinersmuseum.org. Newport News, Virginia. The Museum of Valor. Spotsylvania, Virginia. The Powder Magazine. powdermag.org. Charleston, South Carolina. The restored Burlington Northern Depot and World War II Memorial Museum. depothill.net. The Rising Sun Inn. risingsunin.org. Crownsville, Maryland. The Riverside Museum and Visitors Bureau. lchshistory.org. La Crosse, Wisconsin. The South Carolina Civil War Museum. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The Wright Museum. wrightmuseum.org. Wolfboro, New Hampshire. Thomas Warne Museum. thomas-warne-museum.com. Matawan, New Jersey. Tri-State Living History Association. tslha.org. Quincy, Illinois. Tri-County Genealogical Society. Triangle Tattoo and Museum. triangletattoo.com. Fort Bragg, California. Tropic Lightning Museum. 25idl.army.mil/tropic%20 lightning%20 museum/index.html. Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. U.S. Army Engineer Museum. home.army.mil/wood/index.php/units-tenants/usaes/org/museum. Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. U.S. Cavalry Memorial Research Library. uscavalryassociation.org. El Reno, Oklahoma. U.S. Coast Guard Cutter Ingham Maritime Museum. uscgcingham.org. Key West, Florida. U.S. Army Finance Corps Museum. finance.army.mil/museum/index.html. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. usahec.org. Carlisle, Pennsylvania. U.S. Army Museum of Hawaii. U.S. Army Quartermaster Museum. qmmuseum.lee.army.mil. Fort Lee, Virginia. U.S. Army Transportation Museum. Fort Eustis, Virginia. U.S. Cavalry Museum. riley.army.mil/aboutus/museums.aspx. Fort Riley, Kansas. U.S. Navy Seabee Museum. usnavycbmuseum.com. Port Hueneme, California. U.S. Space and Rocket Center. spacecamp.com. Huntsville, Alabama. U.S. Army Adjutant General's Corps Museum. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. U.S. Army Air Defense Artillery Museum. SIL. army.mil/ada museum. Lawton, Oklahoma. U.S. Army Field Artillery Museum. Sill. Army.mil/fa Museum. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. U.S. Army Ordnance Museum. ordmusefound.org. Aberdeen, Maryland. U.S. Army Women's Museum. awm.lee.army.mil. Fort Lee, Virginia. U.S. Air Force Airman Heritage Museum. myairmanmuseum.org. Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. U.S. Air Force Airman Heritage Training Complex. airmanheritage.com. San Antonio, Texas. U.S. Air Force Security Forces Museum. airmanheritage.com/security-forces-annex. Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. USS Turner Joy. usturnerjoy.org. Bremerton, Washington. United States Naval Shipbuilding Museum. uss-salem.org. Quincy, Massachusetts. Valiant Air Command Varbird Museum and Tico Airshow. vacwarbids.org. Titusville, Florida. Vallejo Naval and Historical Museum. vallejomuseum.org. Vallejo, California. Van Wyck Homestead Museum. Fishkill Historical Society.org. Fishkill, New York. Vandenberg Space and Missile Heritage Center. vandenberg.af.mil/libraries/factshet.asp?ID=4627. Vandenberg AFB, California. Vermilion County War Museum. vcum.org. Danville, Illinois. Vermont Veterans Militia Museum. vtguard.com. Colchester, Vermont. Veterans Memorial Museum. cityofripon.org. Ripon, California. Veterans Memorial Museum. veteransmuseum.org. Chehalis, Washington. Veterans Museum and Memorial Center. veteranmuseum.org. San Diego, California. Vietnam Era Museum and Educational Center. njvvmf.org. Homedale, New Jersey. Virginia Civil War Trails. civilwartraveler.com. Richmond, Virginia. Virginia Museum of Transportation, Inc. vmt.org. Roanoke, Virginia. Virginia Quilt Museum. vaquiltmuseum.org. Harrisonburg, Virginia. Virginia War Memorial. vawarmemorial.org. Richmond, Virginia. Virginia War Museum. warmuseum.org. Newport News, Virginia. WASP World War II Museum. waspmuseum.org. Sweetwater, Texas. William Henry Harrison's Grouseland. grouseland.org. Vincennes, Indiana. WNC Military History Museum. wncmilitaryhistorymuseum.com. Brevard, North Carolina. Warbids West Air Museum, Inc. wwam.org. El Cajon, California. Warhawk Air Museum. warhawkairmuseum.org. Nampa, Idaho. Warren Heritage Museum. warrenmuseum.com. Fe. Warren Air Force Base, Wyoming. Warren Lash Conservation Center. hunley.org/index.asp. North Charleston, South Carolina. Warrenville Historical Museum. warrenvillehistorical.org. Warrenville, Illinois. Wayne County Historical Association and Museum. waynemuseum.org. Goldsboro, North Carolina. Webb Military Museum. webmilitarymuseum.com. Savannah, Indiana. West Point Museum. history.army.mil/museum/mcom/westpoint/index.html. West Point, New York. Wisman Military Museum. wismanmilitarymuseum.com. Hinesville, Georgia. White House of the Confederacy. acum.org/white-house-of-the-Confederacy. Richmond, Virginia. Whitley County Historical Museum. whitleymuseum.com. Columbia City, Indiana. Wilder Memorial Museum. wildermuseum.org. Strawberry Point, Iowa. Willapa Seaport Museum. willapasiaportmuseum.com. Raymond, Washington. Williamson County Historical Society. thuchs.com. Marion, Illinois. Wings Over Miami Air Museum. wingsovermiami.com. Miami, Florida. Wings Over the Rockies Air and Space Museum. wingsmuseum.org. Denver, Colorado. Wings of Freedom Museum, closed. Huntington, Indiana. Wisconsin National Guard Museum. Camp Douglas, Wisconsin. Women in Military Service for America Memorial Foundation. womensmemorial.org. Arlington, Virginia. Woodcraft Nature Center and Museum. culver.org/woodcraft. Culver, Indiana. Woodman Institute Museum. woodmaninstitutemuseum.org. Dover, New Hampshire. World Wars Aircraft Muse. McCourtsville, Indiana. Wyoming State Museum. wyomuseum.state.wy.us. Cheyenne, Wyoming. Wyoming Veterans Memorial Museum. wyomilitary.wy.gov/veterans/museum/vets-museum. Casper, Wyoming. Yuma Proving Ground Heritage Center. Yuma, Arizona. Zeeland Historical Museum. zealandmuseum.org. Zeeland, Michigan. Zippo/Case Museum. zippocasemuseum.com. Bradford, Pennsylvania.